Hi. In this, our final week of Literature of Fantasy, we're looking at Zaffon's Shadow of the Wind. When you read the lectures for this week, you probably noted that there's an undercurrent to the fact that there are all these other branches of literature, genres of fiction, that include fantastic elements, but somehow are distinct from what we traditionally talk about when we talk about fantasy. Even if one includes works which are set in, quote-unquote, the real world, like, for instance, Neverwhere, but have mysterious subworlds, you still don't see the idea that the fantasy can simply intrude on the mundane, or that there is any interplay. Surrealism and magic realism sort of break down that final barrier and say that even everyday lives, even mundane lives, can have truly fantastic elements in them. This novel is hauntingly beautiful in its depiction of Barcelona in post-Civil War Spain. The characters are, while to a certain degree eccentric, are still utterly realistic in their depictions, with some obvious exceptions. And the trials and tribulations of the various characters are the same trials and tribulations that you or I might experience on a daily basis. People who are searching for their identities, people who are searching for love, respect, a livelihood. We're not talking about epic quests here. We're talking about people who are going through their everyday lives. What makes this different than traditional realistic literature is that there's an undercurrent of something else, something fantastical, something magical, that sort of haunts them the way it haunts us as the reader. Now, as to the actual narrative, the story follows what is an increasingly common sort of subgenre of literature, which is, if you think about it, most writers are also readers, and most writers are also obsessive readers. And it's not unheard of for a writer to sort of write that into the book. Okay, so it's a mystery that centers around the idea of authorship. In this particular case, young Daniel stumbles across the work of a largely obscure writer. Okay, and as such, he becomes very obsessed with the idea of finding the other books by this author. The author, Kranc, has led a very troubled life, and we very much suspect that he may in fact be the strange and grotesque character who is calling himself L'Enquibert, after the devil character in one of Kranc's novels. So Kranc has become one of his own characters and is rapidly trying to sort of erase all evidence of himself. Now, Daniel's quest here follows a parallel course to Kranc's own life, and Kranc sees the opportunity to sort of change this for Daniel. But Daniel, who is by and large very naive and very innocent, sort of takes everything at face value, beg your pardon, and doesn't necessarily understand the full context in the way that we, the narrator, or we and the narrator clearly do. The novel is very interesting on a number of different levels, and it's playing on a number of different conventions beyond simply this sort of literary mystery. The various places that are mentioned here. I don't know if you had an opportunity to read the literary tour that's at the end of the book, but it's very much a celebration of Spanish culture and the city of Barcelona as a whole. If you're intrigued by this book, what is billed as a prequel to the book, The Angels Game, was published in 2008. Although I would argue that even though the book is in fact set at or before the actions of this particular novel, it is in many ways a sequel, and in many ways superior to this particular novel. The Angels Game is, if you can conceive of this, even darker than this particular one, and even more beautiful in some regards, but tells the story of another author who is caught in a bizarre sort of, for lack of a better term, game that he doesn't completely understand the rules of, nor does he completely understand the significance of many of the things that are going on. I would also point to you towards the works of people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Lorca, the Surrealists in general, as being a subject worthy of exploration. If you find this idea of the fantastic intruding into the mundane to be a interesting idea to explore later on. Some final points about this particular novel that I'd like to call your attention to. From a literary standpoint, many of the novels and short stories that we've looked at have used fairly straightforward character development and very straightforward characters. Even those characters who have some degree of complexity tend to have sort of a one-sided feel to them. No one ever accused Frodo of being a very rich character. He's certainly a very likable and living character, but he isn't a particularly deep character. And so too many of the protagonists that we've looked at thus far in the class. With the possible exception of the postmodern fantasists. For the most part, we don't look at very sophisticated character studies in fantasy. It tends to distract from the overall work. In contrast to this, Daniel and the various other characters which are explored in this novel are very richly nuanced characters. Despite Daniel's naivete, he's a very complicated and very intricate character. And the way that Zafon develops him through his quest and through the things that befall him and the choices that he makes him very interesting. Secondly, I would point to the fact that this novel contains quite a lot of historical reference. And if you know anything about the Spanish Civil War, which was, of course, explored in Penn's Labyrinth, you know that this was a very bleak time, okay? And recently there's been a lot of literature that sort of re-explores that. So that's all for this week. On a personal note, I would just like to thank all of you. I very much enjoyed teaching this class, and I hope that you have enjoyed the works that we've looked at. And as always, if you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me. Goodbye.